Hi everyone. Welcome to our channel. Macgregor, citing a report purportedly from Asia Times via the Department of Defense, highlights the expectation that once the fighting concludes in Ukraine, the government may relocate from Kiev to the western town of Lviv. Given its historical significance in the likely proximity of Russian forces to the capital, he emphasizes the toll of the conflict, noting conversations with individuals in Ukraine who expressed a plea for Washington's intervention to end the tragedy. Macgregor underscores the devastating casualties of the war. With 500,000 reported dead and an equal number wounded, many facing permanent life-altering injuries. He warns to the drain on Ukraine's resources and manpower, lamenting the potential exodus of its citizens, which would further compound the nation's woes. I'm not true from the standpoint of people on the Hill who are largely disinterested in what happens on the ground in Ukraine. Most of this cash will simply be recycled, as it has been to this point, to purchase weapons and equipment from the Department of Defense. In turn, the money transfers to the defense industries, which profit enormously. The president himself made the point that this is good for America, because it keeps assembly lines humming and large numbers of Americans employed. That may be true, but it won't change the facts on the ground in Ukraine. The reality is that Ukraine has lost its war, and at least half of the country will now be occupied by the Russians, likely permanently. A lot of this money will be used to pay bureaucrats in Kiev and elsewhere in Ukraine to keep services operational. However, several billion will disappear into bank accounts in places like Cyprus, the Bahamas, or elsewhere, where money flows without being carefully tracked. They're laundering money to their friends, who are part of this organized crime state that we're pretending is a real nation-state called Ukraine. Well, certainly applies to Ukraine as far as being a client state is concerned. The client is simply someone who is dependent upon you for income and support. A better word would probably be vassal. Yeah, the Ukrainian leadership is definitely a client of the United States. There's no question about it. That entire apparatus would not exist if Victoria Nuland and her friends had not installed it after the Maidan Revolution. So certainly, since 2014, there's no other way to look at it, although I think the word farce will increasingly be more accurate, since I'm sure there are very few Ukrainians at this point prepared to go out and die for this client state. Now Israel is a little bit different because, frankly, we often wonder who the client is. In other words, are we not the client of the Israeli state? Or is the Israeli state the client of the United States? It is confusing and difficult to establish because, as I pointed out routinely at this stage of our history, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu has infinitely more influence over the conduct of our foreign defense policy than President Biden, despite whatever President Biden or Secretary of State. Lincoln has said publicly, there's not much evidence that anything has happened that Mr. Netanyahu does not want, but calling them both client states is not unreasonable. So, I think in Israel's case, we need to try and sort out that relationship. But he has already failed on what he set out to do. He aimed to erase Ukraine from the map, eliminate its independence, and subsume it into Russia. That endeavor has failed, and cannot and will not succeed. Secondly, Ukraine has not only stood up to the aggression, but over the past year, it reclaimed more than 50% of the territory that had been taken from it. In February of 2022, the last part of the last year has been challenging, but even then, something that got little notice was what Ukraine managed to do in the Black Sea, opening it up, pushing the Russian Navy back and starting to get grain out to the world. It's been the breadbasket of the world, and has returned to that role as a result of that. As for Antony Blinken, he has turned out to be a professional liar. And he's not alone. He's surrounded by them, and they're all deeply in denial. No one wants to admit the truth, which is, first of all, we go to Russia into attacking Ukraine over the objections of the Russians for practically 20 years. We pushed this NATO border issue as far as we possibly could, not because it was in the interest of the United States or supported by the American people, but because this small minority that is in control of our foreign policy apparatus, and now also the Department of Defense, wanted to do it, for reasons that have nothing to do with American national interest. I don't think Victoria Nuland or Antony Blinken or any of their colleagues over the last 15 to 20 years could actually define what American interests are. It's all nonsense. And wherever our friend Wilson tried to spread democracy, something else much less attractive emerged in his place. So Blinken has to be dismissed out of hand. He's simply a liar whose so-called facts or fantasies. Now, Lavrov is a practical man. He's not interested in a global revolution to spread anything. He simply wants to bring the war to an end, because that's in Moscow's interest, and it's in the interest of the Ukrainian nation. This is a war that never needed to happen. It could have easily been avoided had we had a shred of humanity and humility, but we don't. So we have arrogance and ignorance on steroids masquerading as statesmanship. And what comes out at the other end of that process is a blatant lie. The truth says yes. Europeans have fought over many parts of Europe. Many. It's time to end this current war and come to a new solution, which is going to involve a change in borders, something which we refuse to accept. But the Ukrainian people will accept because they know this is a lost war. And to continue, it means more deprivation, more tragedy, more killing, more dying because the Russians have lost nothing. When you look at the casualty figures, we estimate that the Russians have sustained between 80 and perhaps 100,000 casualties, less than half of them involved in killed in action. In other words, somewhere in the neighborhood of 45,000 to 46,000 men killed in action. Now, we've solved the problem in the West of telling the truth by simply lying and saying that this is the case. But the facts on the ground tell us something else, and the facts on the ground will ultimately prevail, regardless of what Mr. Blinken or Mrs. Newland or any of the rest of these people bother to say. Our General Eisenkot is a very capable man, very intelligent, and he understands warfare probably better than most of his peers. He's telling you is the truth. Those hostages are never coming back, or certainly not coming back in any near term. As long as this war of expulsion and murder against the Palestinian people continues, he is, like many Israeli general officers, that you will be someone who is not seem to have likes to say who has skin in the game. In other words, he's not asking Israeli soldiers or Israeli citizens to do anything he and his own family would not also do. My sympathy goes out to him. I think it's tragic that he's lost his son and his nephew, but I think he knows that this war is long-headed, and the longer it lasts, the more damage will be done to it. They're not going to expel or kill every Arab who lives in Gaza, although that is obviously the objective. And I think it's also true that in 60 days, Netanyahu may no longer be there. However, having said all that, I'm not convinced that the Israeli population is prepared to give up on this operation. In fact, I looked at this week's offer of a 2-week ceasefire that Mr. Netanyahu recently tendered to the Palestinians or to Hamas, of course, and many people concluded that this is a temporary ceasefire designed to give these early event sources a breather so that it can assemble new forces for operations against Israel in the north. Now, that would mean at least a 2-front war. Many people would believe it as a 3-front war because the West Bank of Palestine is in upheaval, and we should expect more troops required there to suppress the Arab population. And then, of course, there's also the high probability that if you go to war with Israel, that you then risk war with Iran. One and Mr. Netanyahu, nothing is not desperately committed to dragging us into war with Iran on his behalf. So, and again, I express my sincere condolences to him for the losses. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that Netanyahu will retain his grip on power and drive this offensive forward, not just in Gaza, but also against Israel. In regard to the situation in Israel and Gaza, he considers it extremely critical. He emphasizes that the loss of life, potentially reaching 50,000 or more casualties, deeply affects the Israeli population. He notes that Israeli families, much like those in other complex societies, cannot easily replace loved ones lost in conflict. He believes that as long as the war continues, the situation will worsen. Though he feels this realization may not have fully dawned on the majority of the population yet. Regarding Israeli sentiments toward groups like Hamas, he suggests that the level of animosity could lead some Israelis to not object strongly to extreme measures, such as the use of poison gas against perceived enemies.